What power gave a young man, barely 20 years old, the courage to defy the mightiest empire on earth? Why would only 47,000 Macedonian warriors stand unshaken before more than 100,000 Persians, armed with thunderous cavalry, endless archers, deadly chariots, and towering war elephants? By what miracle did the smaller force not collapse under such overwhelming strength? What secret of leadership, what spark of genius allowed the weak to rise above the strong and turn the tide of history itself? The answer lies in the clash of two worlds, Alexander of Macedon and Darius of Persia. And to understand how destiny was forged at Gaugamela, we must begin with the storm that brought them to this battlefield. A clash was inevitable. For years, the Persian Empire had been the largest, wealthiest, and most feared power on earth. Stretching from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of India, it commanded millions of subjects, countless resources, and armies that dwarfed those of its rivals. At its head stood King Darius III, determined to defend his throne and crush a young challenger who dared to defy him. That challenger was Alexander of Macedon. Barely 25 years old, yet already undefeated in battle, Alexander had marched his men across Asia Minor, stormed the gates of Tyre, and declared himself Pharaoh of Egypt. His victories had humiliated Darius, and now, on the plains near a village called Gaugamela, the two greatest forces of the ancient world would finally collide. The numbers told a chilling story. Darius brought with him a massive host. Some ancient accounts claim over 200,000 men, though modern estimates suggest closer to 100,000. The Persians fielded everything: heavy cavalry, skilled archers, scythe chariots designed to slice through men like grass, and even terrifying war elephants meant to crush the enemy's spirit before the fighting began. Against this tidal wave, Alexander commanded barely 47,000 troops. His army was small but battle-hardened, the fearsome Macedonian phalanx with their 18-foot sarissas, long spears that bristled like a forest of death. His cavalry, especially the companion horsemen, were elite warriors, loyal to their king and trained to follow his every maneuver. Strength faced strength, weakness faced weakness. The Persians had numbers, space, and a wide battlefield chosen carefully by Darius himself. Yet their ranks were swollen with levies, men called to fight without discipline or experience. Alexander, by contrast, lacked numbers, but held the advantage of unity, discipline, and perhaps the greatest weapon of all, his own genius. As dawn approached, both armies stood ready. The fate of empires hung in the balance. Would the sheer might of Persia crush the young Macedonian? Or would Alexander's daring strategy carve his name forever into the chronicles of history? The storm was about to break. Darius chose his ground with care. He knew Alexander's cavalry was fast, disciplined, and devastating. To counter this, he ordered the plains of Gaugamela flattened, every ditch filled, every bump leveled, so that his war chariots could unleash their fury. Scythed chariots with blades mounted on their wheels gleamed in the sun like instruments of slaughter. To Persian eyes, it was the perfect killing field. On the morning of October 1st, 331 BC, the Persian host stretched as far as the eye could see. Darius placed himself at the very center, high upon a royal chariot, surrounded by his elite guard, the so-called immortals. To his left, vast waves of cavalry and archers. To his right, more horsemen, ready to envelop the enemy. And behind them, elephants towered above the ranks, trumpeting like creatures from another world. The Macedonian line, by contrast, looked small, almost fragile. Alexander arranged his 47,000 men in a formation that emphasized precision over mass. At the center stood the phalanx, sarissas angled forward like a bristling wall of spears. On his right, Alexander placed his most trusted soldiers, the companion cavalry, close to him, for he planned to strike with them when the time was right. On the left, his general Parmenion commanded Thessalian horsemen, tasked with holding against the overwhelming Persian numbers. As night fell on the eve of battle, the contrast between the two camps was stark. Across the plain, the Persian camp blazed with countless fires, a sea of torches stretching to the horizon. Drums thundered, horses neighed, soldiers shouted, an overwhelming display meant to terrify the enemy. In the Macedonian camp, silence reigned. The men sharpened their weapons, repaired their armor, and waited. They had fought together for years, from the rivers of Granicus to the walls of Tyre. They trusted their king, and their king trusted them. That bond was their strength. Alexander himself walked among his soldiers, speaking softly, reminding them that though the Persians were many, they were fighting for glory, for honor, and for a place in history. To his men, he was not just a commander, he was destiny itself. The night sky hung heavy with stars. Two armies, one vast and proud, the other small but unbroken, stood ready for the dawn. When the first light touched the plains of Gaugamela, the world would never be the same again. The dawn of October first broke with a silence so heavy, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then came the sound, the thunder of war drums, the blare of horns, the shouts of thousands. The Battle of Gaugamela had begun. The Persian cavalry surged forward first, a sea of horsemen sweeping across the plain. Arrows darkened the sky, falling like rain upon the Macedonian lines. Shields clashed, men grunted, the ground shook under the charge. Darius had unleashed the full weight of his empire. And then came the chariots. Dozens of scythed war chariots thundered forward, their wheels fitted with blades meant to hack through flesh and bone. Horses screamed, drivers whipped furiously. The plain itself trembled beneath their speed. To an untrained army, it would have meant annihilation. But Alexander was ready. At his command, the Macedonian phalanx opened sudden gaps in their formation. The chariots, instead of mowing men down, plunged into empty corridors where javelins and spears rained upon them. Horses fell, drivers were cut down, and the terror machines became twisted wreckage. What Darius thought would break Alexander's army instead shattered against its discipline. Yet the storm did not stop. On the Macedonian left, the Persian cavalry pressed hard against Parmenion's Thessalians. The clash was brutal. Men pulled from their saddles, blades flashing in the chaos, hooves trampling the fallen. Parmenion fought desperately to hold his line. If the left wing collapsed, the entire Macedonian army would be encircled. At the center, the phalanx locked shields, sarissas thrusting outward in deadly rhythm. Arrows thudded against bronze, swords rang against spear shafts. Dust rose thick, screams echoed, and the field became a maelstrom of blood and steel. And through it all, Alexander watched with the eyes of a predator. Calm, calculating, he waited for the moment the Persians would overreach. His genius was not in raw strength, but in timing, in knowing when to strike. The first storm had passed, but the battle was only just beginning. The battlefield was chaos, dust, blood, and thunder. On the left, Parmenians struggled desperately against the weight of Persian cavalry. At the center, the phalanx held firm, sarissas stabbing like a wall of iron. But Alexander's eyes were fixed elsewhere. He was watching Darius. The Persian king, standing tall in his chariot, directed wave after wave at the Macedonian line. He believed sheer numbers would eventually grind them down. But in his confidence, he stretched his wings too far. His cavalry surged outward, spreading wide in an attempt to envelop Alexander's flanks. And in that moment, the trap was sprung. Alexander gave the signal. With the companion cavalry at his side, he wheeled hard to the left, forming a wedge that cut through the dust. Horses pounded, spears leveled, the king himself at the tip of the charge. It was not retreat. It was a spear aimed at the very heart of Persia. They thundered straight toward the gap between the Persian, left and center, driving like an arrow toward Darius himself. The immortals, Darius's elite guard, rushed to protect their king, but the Macedonians smashed into them with unstoppable fury. Men were thrown from their saddles, shields splintered, cries filled the air. And then the unthinkable. For the first time, Darius wavered. From his vantage point, he saw the young conqueror racing toward him, cutting down everything in his path. Fear gripped him. If Alexander reached him, the empire was lost in a single stroke. In panic, Darius turned his chariot and fled. His guard tried to cover his retreat, but the sight was devastating. The King of Kings, the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known, was running. A ripple of terror spread across the Persian line. Soldiers who had fought bravely moments before now hesitated, their courage breaking. Alexander's gamble had paid off. In one masterstroke, he had turned the tide of battle. The fate of empires now hung on the chaos left behind. The moment Darius fled, the battle transformed from a contest of arms into a storm of chaos. The Persian center, once anchored by the presence of their king, began to tremble. Soldiers glanced over their shoulders, seeing their ruler's chariot vanish into the dust. Fear spread like wildfire. But not all surrendered to panic. On the Persian left, cavalry still clashed with Parmenians' Thessalians. The fighting there was savage beyond description. Horse against horse, man against man, swords ringing as riders grappled in the dust. Blades bit through flesh, shields splintered, bodies toppled beneath the pounding hooves. The Thessalians fought like lions, knowing that if they broke, the Macedonian army would be surrounded. At the center, the Macedonian phalanx advanced step by step, their sarissas driving forward with mechanical precision. Every thrust claimed another life. The Persian infantry, less disciplined, began to falter under the iron wall pressing against them. Their arrows and short spears could not pierce the forest of sarissas. What began as a battle line soon became a massacre. On the right, Alexander pressed his attack, carving through the Persian elite. His companion cavalry fought with relentless fury, cutting down Darius's guard. Every charge widened the gap, every fallen enemy deepened the panic. Dust and blood hung in the air until the battlefield itself seemed to choke. Yet even in the midst of collapse, the Persians resisted fiercely. Some units fought to the last breath, determined to die with honor. Others, trapped and surrounded, threw down their weapons in surrender, only to be trampled in the confusion. The plain of Gaugamela had become a graveyard. By midday, the field was littered with wreckage. Chariots overturned and burning, elephants rampaging uncontrolled, soldiers scattered in every direction. The once proud Persian army was broken, and Alexander stood victorious, his sword raised, his men roaring in triumph. Against impossible odds, he had shattered the might of Persia. The empire of Darius was crumbling before the eyes of the world. When the dust finally settled, the plain of Gaugamela was unrecognizable. Where once had stood the proud army of Persia, now lay ruins, broken chariots, shattered shields, fallen warriors, and the echoes of a defeated empire. The Battle of Gaugamela was over. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of Persians lay dead or scattered, their formations utterly destroyed. The Macedonians, though bloodied and exhausted, had lost only a fraction in comparison. Against impossible odds, Alexander had achieved the unthinkable. He had broken the spine of the largest empire the ancient world had ever known. Darius III fled eastward, abandoned by his army, his prestige shattered. Once the King of Kings, he was now a fugitive, hunted even by his own satraps. Within a year, he would be betrayed and murdered by his generals, leaving Alexander to claim the throne of Persia uncontested. For Alexander, Gaugamela was more than a victory, it was destiny fulfilled. He was no longer just the king of Macedon. He was the master of Asia, heir to centuries of Persian kings, and a conqueror whose shadow stretched across the world. From the Nile to the Indus, lands would fall under his banner. But the legacy of Gaugamela was not written only in blood and conquest. It was the beginning of a new era, the Hellenistic age, when Greek culture, language, and ideas would spread far beyond the Mediterranean, blending with the traditions of the East. It was an age born from the clash of civilizations, from the courage of men who stood against overwhelming odds. And so, the Battle of Gaugamela entered legend. It was not merely a fight for land or for power. It was the moment when the fate of continents shifted, when a young king proved that brilliance, discipline, and courage could overcome the mightiest of empires. The world after Gaugamela would never be the same again.